My sister called the cops on me for living in her house, but when that police captain looked at me and snapped to attention saying, "General, your orders," everything changed. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the kitchen window where we stood arguing, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor that had seen so many family disputes over the years. I was wearing my usual civilian clothes, a faded gray t-shirt and jeans that made me look like exactly what my family thought I was, a 42-year-old failure living off his younger sister's charity. Sarah stood there with her arms crossed, her business suit perfectly pressed even at the end of a long day at the law firm, looking every inch the successful attorney she had worked so hard to become. Her voice was sharp with frustration when she said I had exactly 1 hour to pack my things and get out, or she would call the police and have me removed for trespassing. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are watching from. I love hearing how far this story reaches and knowing I am not alone in this moment. The argument had been building for weeks, maybe months if I am being honest. Sarah had reached the end of her patience with what she saw as my complete lack of direction, my inability to hold down a job, my constant presence in the house she had worked so hard to buy. From her perspective, I was a deadbeat older brother who had moved in 6 months ago claiming I needed time to get back on my feet, and had done nothing but take advantage of her kindness ever since. She would come home from 12-hour days at the firm to find me sitting on her couch, sometimes reading, sometimes just staring out the window, always seeming to have nothing productive to report about my day. Her friends had started asking questions, gentle at first, then more pointed, about how long her brother would be staying and whether she thought I was really trying to find work. What Sarah did not know, what none of my family knew, was that every moment of my apparent laziness was carefully orchestrated. The phone calls I took in the other room were not unemployment office check-ins or half-hearted job inquiries. They were briefings from Pentagon officials, updates on classified operations that required my immediate attention, urgent communications about matters of national security that I could not discuss with anyone, not even family. The long absences I explained away as job hunting were actually meetings at secure facilities, strategy sessions in unmarked government buildings, classified briefings that sometimes lasted 18 hours straight. When I told Sarah I had been at interviews all day, I had actually been coordinating with intelligence agencies on operations that would never make the news, that the public would never know about. That required someone with my specific experience and security clearance. My physical condition should have been a clue, but Sarah just assumed I was one of those guys who stayed in shape out of vanity or habit. She never questioned why a supposedly unemployed man had the muscle tone and alertness of someone in active training. She never wondered why I woke up every morning at 5:30 and spent an hour doing what looked like random exercises in her basement. She never asked why my posture was so straight, why I moved with such precise economy of motion, why I seemed to assess every room I entered with the systematic attention of someone trained in threat evaluation. To her, these were just quirks of a brother who had never quite figured out how to be a normal civilian. The family dinners were the hardest part. Every Sunday, we would gather at our parents' house, and I would sit quietly while Sarah updated everyone on her latest cases, her recent promotions, her growing reputation in the legal community. Then the conversation would turn to me, and the questions would come with that particular mixture of concern and disappointment that families reserve for their most troubling members. "How is the job search going?" they would ask. Had I had any promising interviews lately? Was I really trying, or was I just taking advantage of Sarah's generosity? I would give vague answers about opportunities and development, about waiting to hear back from potential employers, about taking time to figure out the right direction for my career. Our parents had long since stopped expecting much from me. Dad would sometimes pull me aside and suggest I consider going back to school, maybe learning a trade, something practical that could give me a stable income and some self-respect. Mom would slip me $50 when she thought no one was looking, her way of helping without having to acknowledge that her older son needed charity from his younger sister. They had been so proud when Sarah graduated law school, when she landed her first job at the prestigious firm, when she bought her own house before 30. They had expected similar things from me, but those expectations had faded over the years as I seemed to drift from one false start to another. My younger brother Marcus was the worst. He had found success in tech, started his own company, and saw my situation as a personal embarrassment to the family name. He would make comments about responsibility and accountability, about how a man my age should have his life together, about how it was not fair for Sarah to support someone who was not even trying. Marcus had no patience for what he saw as my lack of ambition, my unwillingness to take any job that was offered, my apparent comfort with being dependent on others. He would lecture me about the importance of hard work and determination, completely unaware that I had spent the last 15 years working harder than he could possibly imagine, just not in ways that he could see or understand. The irony was overwhelming sometimes. While Marcus was building his startup and Sarah was climbing the legal ladder, I was serving in ways that required absolute secrecy, absolute sacrifice of personal recognition, absolute commitment to something larger than individual success. The missions I had undertaken, the operations I had led, the crises I had helped resolve would never be public knowledge. The men and women under my command knew my worth. The officials who briefed me understood my value. The intelligence community respected my judgment and experience. But my own family saw only failure, only a man who could not seem to get his act together, only a burden that one of them had reluctantly agreed to carry. There were moments when I almost broke, when the temptation to reveal the truth became almost unbearable. When Marcus would go on about personal responsibility, I wanted to tell him about the 3 purple hearts in a classified safety deposit box. When Sarah would sigh about my lack of direction, I wanted to show her the commendations from operations that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. When my parents would look at me with that mixture of love and disappointment, I wanted to explain that their son had spent his adult life serving his country in ways that required him to appear to be exactly what they thought he was, a failure. But operational security meant that my cover had to be absolute. The assignment I was currently working required me to be exactly what I appeared to be, an unemployed man with no apparent prospects, no obvious skills, no clear future. My handlers had made it clear that any break in character, any hint of my real identity, could compromise not just my own safety, but the safety of other operatives, the success of ongoing missions, the security of classified information that could not be allowed to surface. So I endured the family dinners and the pointed questions and the obvious disappointment, knowing that my sacrifice was necessary, that my apparent failure was actually a form of service. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah had been particularly stressed about a difficult case, working late every night for 2 weeks, and she came home to find me reading quietly in her living room. Something about my presence, my calm contentment in her space while she was exhausted and overwhelmed, finally pushed her past her limit. She demanded to know what I had done with my day, whether I had applied for any jobs, whether I had any intention of ever contributing to household expenses or just planned to live off her indefinitely. I gave my usual vague answers about ongoing applications and promising leads, but Sarah was past the point of accepting those explanations. She wanted specifics. She wanted proof that I was actually trying. She wanted some evidence that I respected her enough to make a real effort rather than just coasting on her generosity. When I could not provide the details she demanded, when I continued to deflect and redirect, her frustration boiled over into genuine anger. She told me that she was tired of making excuses for me to her friends, tired of watching me waste my life, tired of enabling behavior that was clearly not helping me grow or change or improve. She said that I had become a source of embarrassment for her, that people were starting to question her judgment for allowing the situation to continue, that she could not keep subsidizing my apparent refusal to take responsibility for my own life. Her words stung because they were not entirely wrong from her perspective, because I could not explain that my apparent irresponsibility was actually the most responsible thing I had ever done. The ultimatum came suddenly but not unexpectedly. Sarah said that she had been patient long enough, that she had given me every opportunity to prove that I was serious about changing my situation, and that I had consistently failed to show any real progress or effort. She said that I had 1 hour to pack my belongings and find somewhere else to stay, that she was done enabling what she saw as my self-destructive patterns, that continuing to house me was preventing both of us from moving forward with our lives. I asked where she expected me to go on such short notice, but Sarah said that was not her problem anymore. She had been researching tenant laws and knew that since I was not on the lease and had not been paying rent, she had every right to ask me to leave immediately. She said that maybe facing the reality of homelessness would finally motivate me to take whatever job I could find, even if it was not the perfect position I seemed to be holding out for. Her voice was cold and determined in a way I had never heard before. When I did not immediately start packing, when I tried to ask for just a few more days to make arrangements, Sarah pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police. She said that if I would not leave voluntarily, she would have me removed for trespassing, that she was tired of being reasonable and accommodating with someone who clearly had no intention of respecting her boundaries or her generosity. I told her that calling the police seemed extreme, that we could work something out, but Sarah was already dialing. The conversation with the dispatcher was brief and to the point. Sarah identified herself as a homeowner with a trespasser who was refusing to leave despite being asked multiple times. She gave her address and answered the dispatcher's questions about whether the situation was violent or threatening, assuring them that while she felt unsafe, there was no immediate physical danger. She described me as her unemployed brother who had been staying in her house without permission and was now refusing to leave when asked. While we waited for the police to arrive, Sarah paced around the kitchen, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of anger and what might have been regret. I sat quietly at her kitchen table, hands folded, maintaining the calm demeanor that my family had always mistaken for apathy or resignation. Sarah kept muttering about how it had come to this, how she never thought she would have to call the police on her own brother, how I had forced her into a situation she had never wanted to create. I could have told her then that the phone in my pocket contained direct numbers for officials who could have resolved this situation with a single call. I could have mentioned that my security clearance was higher than most state governors, that my current assignment required coordination with multiple federal agencies, that the apparent unemployment she was so concerned about was actually a cover for work that carried the highest levels of national importance. But operational security meant that my cover had to hold, even now, even as my sister prepared to have me arrested for being exactly what my assignment required me to appear to be. The irony was sharp and painful. Sarah was calling the police to remove someone she saw as a burden and a failure, not knowing that the man she was having arrested had spent years protecting people like her, serving in ways that required him to sacrifice his own reputation and family relationships for the greater good. The officers who would arrive would see exactly what I needed them to see, a situation involving family dispute and trespassing, nothing more complicated or significant than a domestic issue requiring routine resolution. But I also knew that among the responding officers, there was always a chance that someone would recognize me, someone who had served under my command or worked with me in joint operations or attended briefings where my face and voice were familiar. The military and law enforcement communities in our area were interconnected in ways that civilians did not always understand, and my years of service had created relationships and recognition that extended beyond the classified world where my current identity was known. As we heard the police cars pulling into the driveway, I felt a strange mixture of resignation and anticipation. This moment would either maintain my cover perfectly, allowing me to be processed as exactly what I appeared to be, or it would become the catalyst that finally revealed the truth my family had never been allowed to know. Sarah moved toward the front door to meet the officers, her shoulders set with determination. Completely unaware that she was about to discover everything she thought she knew about her brother was carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect both her and the country we both called home. The first officer through the door was young, maybe 25, with the crisp uniform and eager demeanor of someone still proving himself on the force. Behind him came his partner, an older sergeant with gray at his temples and the measured movements of someone who had seen every type of domestic situation imaginable. Sarah immediately launched into her explanation, pointing at me and describing the trespassing situation with the precise legal language that came naturally to her as an attorney. The officers listened politely, taking notes, asking standard questions about how long I had been staying there and whether there had been any previous incidents or threats. I remained seated at the kitchen table, hands visible, responding to their questions with simple yes sir and no sir answers that probably reinforced their impression of me as exactly what Sarah was describing. When they asked for identification, I provided my civilian driver's license, the one that listed my address as Sarah's house and showed my occupation as unemployed. The younger officer ran my information through their system while his partner continued gathering details about the family relationship and the circumstances that had led to Sarah's call. What none of them could see was the weight of memories flooding through me as I sat there, the sharp contrast between this moment and the countless times I had been the one in authority, the one making decisions about other people's fates and futures. My mind drifted back to a briefing room in Kandahar 15 years ago, where I had first learned that leadership meant making choices that other people could not understand, carrying burdens that could not be shared, accepting responsibility for outcomes that might never be publicly acknowledged. I was 31 then, already a colonel with 2 combat deployments behind me, when General Harrison called me into his office and changed the trajectory of my entire life. He told me that my combination of field experience, strategic thinking, and ability to remain calm under pressure had brought me to the attention of people at the highest levels of military intelligence. He said there was an opportunity to serve in ways that would require sacrifices most officers never had to consider, assignments that would demand absolute secrecy and complete commitment to missions that could never be discussed or recognized publicly. The program he described was designed to create deep cover assets within the military leadership structure, officers who could operate in civilian environments while maintaining their military authority and responsibilities. These assignments required individuals who could convincingly appear to be failures, who could live double lives for years at a time, who could endure personal cost and family misunderstanding for the sake of national security objectives that demanded absolute operational secrecy. General Harrison explained that my cover would need to be complete and convincing. My family would have to believe that I had left the military under circumstances that made regular employment difficult, that I was struggling with direction and purpose, that I had become the kind of person who needed help from relatives to maintain basic stability. He said this deception would be necessary not just for my safety, but for theirs, because the operations I would be involved in carried risks that extended to anyone who might be seen as having knowledge of my real work. The first assignment took me to Eastern Europe, where I spent 2 years appearing to be a failed businessman while actually coordinating intelligence operations that helped stabilize a region on the brink of civil war. My family received occasional emails describing my struggles with failed ventures and disappointed investors, never knowing that their son and brother was actually working 18-hour days to prevent conflicts that could have drawn American forces into another prolonged military engagement. Between assignments, I would return home for brief periods, always with stories of setbacks and disappointments that explained my lack of conventional success. My family's reaction was predictable and painful. Dad would try to offer advice about realistic career choices, Mom would worry about my apparent lack of direction, and my siblings would privately discuss their concern about my inability to find stable employment or meaningful relationships. The hardest part was watching their disappointment grow over the years, seeing them lose faith in my potential, observing their gradual shift from encouragement to resignation about my prospects. Sarah had been particularly supportive in the early years, offering to help with job searches, suggesting contacts in her professional network, even offering to pay for additional education or training if I wanted to pursue a new field. But as years passed and I continued to appear directionless and unsuccessful, her support turned to frustration and eventually to the kind of tired resignation that had led to today's ultimatum. What my family never knew was that during those years of apparent failure, I had been promoted to brigadier general, then major general, accumulating commendations and responsibilities that would have made them proud if they could have known about them. The operations I led saved lives, prevented attacks, protected American interests in ways that required absolute secrecy, but delivered results that made the entire country safer. The mission that brought me to Sarah's house 6 months ago was perhaps the most critical of my career. Intelligence agencies had identified a domestic terrorism network that was planning coordinated attacks on multiple civilian targets across the region. The cell was sophisticated, well-funded, and had successfully avoided detection by traditional law enforcement methods. My role was to establish myself in the community as an unremarkable civilian, someone whose presence would not attract attention, while coordinating a complex operation that involved federal agencies, local law enforcement, and specialized military units. Living with Sarah provided the perfect cover. A middle-aged man staying with his successful sister looked exactly like what everyone assumed it was, a family situation involving economic hardship and personal failure. No one questioned why I spent so much time at home, why I seemed to have no regular schedule, why I was often unavailable for social activities or family gatherings. My apparent unemployment explained everything while revealing nothing about the classified facilities I visited, the secure communications I maintained, the ongoing surveillance and coordination work that occupied every day. The phone calls I took in private were briefings from team leaders updating me on surveillance progress, intelligence analysts reporting on intercepted communications, operational commanders requesting authorization for tactical adjustments. The times I disappeared for entire days were meetings at undisclosed locations where we planned coordinated responses to emerging threats, where we analyzed intelligence that could not be transmitted through normal channels, where we prepared for operations that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Sarah's house had actually been chosen specifically because of its location, its proximity to key targets the terrorist cell was monitoring, its position within the community that allowed for natural observation and intelligence gathering. My presence there was not the desperate arrangement of a man with no other options, but a carefully planned strategic positioning that gave our operation maximum effectiveness while maintaining complete operational security. The neighbors who saw me as Sarah's unemployed brother, the family members who worried about my lack of direction, the community members who occasionally wondered about the quiet man who seemed to spend his days doing nothing productive, had no way of knowing that their safety depended partly on my ability to appear exactly as unremarkable and unsuccessful as they perceived me to be. Every morning when I appeared to be sleeping late, I was actually participating in dawn briefings with team leaders coordinating surveillance activities across multiple locations. Every afternoon when Sarah came home to find me reading or watching television, I had actually spent hours analyzing intelligence reports, reviewing operational updates, making strategic decisions that affected the safety of thousands of people. Every evening when I seemed to have nothing important to report about my day, I had actually been working on matters that carried classification levels that prevented me from acknowledging their existence to anyone without the highest security clearances. The operation had been building toward a critical phase for weeks. We had identified the key players in the terrorist network, mapped their communication patterns, tracked their resource acquisition, and prepared coordinated responses that would neutralize the threat without alerting other cells to our methods and capabilities. My role as the apparent civilian failure provided essential cover for coordination activities that required someone who could move freely in the community without attracting the attention that would come to anyone with obvious military or law enforcement connections. But the stress of maintaining deep cover for months had been wearing on everyone involved, and particularly on the family relationships that were suffering under the weight of necessary deceptions. Sarah's frustration had been mounting for weeks, and I had known that some kind of confrontation was inevitable. What I had not anticipated was that her decision to call the police would occur at exactly the moment when the operation was entering its most sensitive phase. The young officer finished running my identification and returned with a clean record, no outstanding warrants, no history of violent or criminal behavior. This information seemed to surprise him slightly, as if he had expected someone being arrested for trespassing to have some kind of problematic background. His partner continued questioning Sarah about the living arrangement, confirming that I was not on the lease, had not been paying rent, and was being asked to leave by the legal resident and property owner. As they prepared to begin the standard procedure for removing an unwanted occupant, I heard the sound of another vehicle pulling into the driveway. The young officer glanced toward the window and mentioned that their supervisor was arriving, probably to oversee what was obviously a family situation that required careful handling. Sarah looked satisfied that additional authority was being brought to bear on what she saw as my final refusal to take responsibility for my own life. I felt my heart rate increase slightly, not from fear of arrest, but from the possibility that the supervising officer might be someone who would recognize me, someone whose knowledge of my real identity could compromise everything I had worked to protect. The mission I was currently involved in was too critical, too close to completion, to risk exposure through an accidental recognition that would raise questions about why a general was living undercover in a domestic situation. The footsteps on the front walkway were measured and confident, the stride of someone accustomed to authority and respect. Through the window, I could see the supervisor approaching the door, and something about his bearing, his posture, the way he carried himself made my chest tighten with recognition and concern. This was not going to be the routine domestic call that Sarah expected, and it was not going to be the simple cover maintenance that my handlers had assumed would be possible. The supervisor reached the front door, and I heard Sarah moving to answer it, completely unaware that the next few minutes would shatter everything she thought she knew about her brother and transform her understanding of the man she had just had arrested for being a failure. The door opened and Captain Rodriguez stepped into the house, his uniform perfectly pressed, his bearing unmistakably military even in civilian law enforcement. I recognized him immediately, and from the way his eyes found mine across the room, I knew he recognized me too. We had served together in Afghanistan, where he had been a young lieutenant under my command during some of the most dangerous operations of his military career. He had saved my life twice, and I had saved his once, the kind of shared experience that creates bonds deeper than family, stronger than time. For a moment that felt like an hour, Captain Rodriguez stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes moving from my face to the domestic scene around him, trying to process what he was seeing. Sarah was still explaining the trespassing situation, describing me as her unemployed brother who refused to leave despite being asked repeatedly, completely unaware that she was talking about the man who had once commanded an entire brigade in active combat zones. The two younger officers were preparing their paperwork for a routine removal, having no idea that they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about authority and respect. Captain Rodriguez took 3 steps into the room, and I could see the exact moment when recog. Nitayon became certainty, when he realized that the man sitting calmly at the kitchen table was not just someone who looked familiar, but was actually Major General Williams, the officer who had taught him what leadership meant, who had shown him how to make impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, who had been decorated for valor more times than most soldiers ever see combat. He stopped walking, straightened to perfect attention, and in a voice that carried 15 years of respect and gratitude, said the words that would shatter Sarah's world. "General, your orders, sir." The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the sound of Sarah's breath catching in her throat as she tried to process what she had just heard. The younger officers looked confused, glancing between their supervisor and the man they had come to arrest, not understanding why their captain was addressing a trespasser with military rank and obvious deference. Sarah stared at Captain Rodriguez as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. She looked at me, then back at the captain, then at me again, her legal mind struggling to make sense of information that contradicted everything she thought she understood about reality. "General," she repeated slowly, the words sounding strange and impossible in her voice. She shook her head as if trying to clear it, as if she thought she might have misheard or misunderstood what was happening in her own kitchen. I stood slowly, maintaining the careful balance between my civilian cover and the military bearing that Captain Rodriguez's recognition had suddenly made relevant again. "Sir," I said quietly, "we have a situation here that requires careful handling. My operational security is currently active, and this recognition could compromise ongoing classified activities." Captain Rodriguez understood immediately, his training taking over as he assessed the complexity of what was unfolding. The captain turned to his officers and told them to wait outside, that he would handle this situation personally and brief them later. His tone carried absolute authority, the kind of command presence that made subordinates obey without question even when they did not understand the reasoning. The younger officers exchanged glances but followed orders, leaving through the front door and taking positions by their patrol cars. Sarah found her voice and demanded to know what was happening, why the police captain was calling her brother General, whether this was some kind of mistake or confusion. Her professional composure was cracking as she struggled to reconcile the unemployed man she had just had arrested with the figure of obvious authority that Captain Rodriguez was treating with such clear respect and deference. Captain Rodriguez looked at me with a question in his eyes, and I gave him the slightest nod, understanding that operational security now required some level of truth to prevent a situation that could compromise more than just my current assignment. "Sir," he said to me, "your family was not aware of your current status. I can see that this situation requires delicate handling to maintain both operational security and family relationships." General Williams, Captain Rodriguez said, turning to address Sarah directly, is one of the most decorated officers in the United States military. He has served with distinction in multiple combat zones, led operations that have saved countless American lives, and currently holds one of the highest security clearances in the armed forces. The man you know as your unemployed brother has spent the last 6 months working on classified operations that I cannot discuss, but which have directly contributed to preventing terrorist attacks on American soil. Sarah's legs seemed to give out, and she grabbed the kitchen counter for support, staring at me as if seeing a completely different person occupying the same space her brother had filled moments before. "This is impossible," she whispered. "You have been unemployed for years. You live here because you cannot afford your own place. You have no job, no prospects, no direction." Her voice was rising with each word, tinged with hysteria as her understanding of reality shifted beneath her feet. I remained silent, understanding that this revelation was traumatic for her, that learning the truth about someone you thought you knew completely was a form of shock that required time and patience to process. Captain Rodriguez continued his explanation, his voice gentle but firm, making it clear that my apparent unemployment was actually sophisticated cover for work that required me to appear exactly as I had appeared to my family. The captain explained that deep cover assignments were among the most difficult and necessary roles in modern military service, requiring officers to sacrifice personal recognition and family understanding for the sake of national security objectives that could not be accomplished through conventional means. He said that the men and women who accepted these assignments gave up the normal satisfactions of military service, the public acknowledgement and family pride that usually came with distinguished careers, in order to serve in ways that demanded absolute secrecy and personal sacrifice. Sarah was crying now, quiet tears that spoke to the magnitude of her realization about how completely she had misunderstood the situation she thought she knew so well. She looked at me with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of pride, though it was too early for her to fully process what she was learning about her brother's real life and service. "I want to understand," she said, her voice shaking. "You have been here for 6 months, and I have been treating you like a burden, like a failure, like someone who is taking advantage of my generosity. Meanwhile, you have been serving your country in ways I cannot even comprehend. How could you let me call you a deadbeat when you are actually a general? How could you sit there and listen to Marcus lecture you about responsibility when you have been carrying responsibilities I cannot even imagine?" Captain Rodriguez answered before I could speak, explaining that operational security meant that my cover had to be maintained even with family, especially with family, because personal relationships were often the most vulnerable points in deep cover assignments. He said that my ability to endure family disappointment and personal misunderstanding was actually evidence of the strength and commitment that made me effective in roles that required extraordinary personal sacrifice. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside interrupted our conversation, and Captain Rodriguez went to the window to see what was happening. He returned with a concerned expression, explaining that backup units had arrived in response to what appeared to be an unusual situation developing at what should have been a routine domestic call. The presence of a supervising officer spending extended time inside suggested to other units that something more complex than simple trespassing was occurring. I realized that my operational security was now compromised beyond repair, that the careful cover I had maintained for 6 months was dissolving in real time, and that decisions had to be made about how to proceed with both the family situation and the ongoing classified mission that had brought me here. Captain Rodriguez understood the implications as well, and I could see him calculating the best way to protect both operational security and family relationships in a situation that threatened both. Sarah was still processing the fundamental shift in her understanding of reality, staring at me as if trying to see the general hiding inside the brother she thought she knew. She asked how long I had been serving in this capacity, how many years of her disappointment had actually been years of my service to something larger than personal success. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and horror as she began to understand the scope of her misunderstanding. Captain Rodriguez told her that the details of my service record were classified, but that my dedication and effectiveness were legendary among those who had served with me or worked under my command. He said that the operations I had led and the decisions I had made had directly contributed to American security in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged, but which had earned the respect and gratitude of military leadership at the highest levels. The revelation was transforming Sarah's perception not just of me, but of herself and her own behavior over the past months. She realized that every criticism she had made, every expression of disappointment, every lecture about responsibility and accountability had been directed at someone who was actually serving with distinction in ways that demanded exactly the kind of apparent irresponsibility she had been condemning. I finally spoke, my voice carrying the authority that I had kept carefully hidden for months, but which now seemed appropriate to reveal. "Sarah," I said, "your frustration has been completely understandable. From your perspective, you have been supporting someone who appeared to be taking advantage of your kindness without making any effort to improve his situation. You could not have known that my presence here was actually part of an assignment that required me to appear exactly as I appeared to you." She shook her head, still struggling to integrate this new information with months of accumulated resentment and disappointment. "I called the police on a general," she said, the absurdity of the situation finally beginning to register. "I had my own brother arrested for trespassing when he was actually here serving his country. I told Mom and Dad that you were hopeless, that you would never amount to anything, that I was tired of enabling your failures." Captain Rodriguez suggested that we move the conversation to a more private setting, given that other officers were waiting outside and that the situation had implications beyond the immediate family dispute. He recommended that Sarah and I continue our discussion while he handled the external complications of having responded to a domestic call involving a general officer under deep cover assignment. The weight of the revelation was settling over all of us, changing the atmosphere in the room from domestic conflict to something approaching a security briefing. Sarah was beginning to understand that her house had been more than just a family refuge, that my presence there had been connected to work that involved protecting people like her from threats she had never known existed. I explained that the mission was nearing completion, that the months of apparent unemployment had actually been months of careful preparation for operations that would soon neutralize threats that had been developing in our community for over a year. I told her that her unwitting cooperation, her provision of natural civilian cover, had been essential to the success of activities that could not have been accomplished through conventional military or law enforcement approaches. The front door opened again, and Captain Rodriguez returned with information that additional federal agents were en route to handle the classified aspects of the situation, that my operational commanders had been notified of the security breach, and that protocols were being implemented to manage both the ongoing mission and the family complications that had developed from the exposure of my cover. Sarah sat down heavily in one of her kitchen chairs, the same chairs where we had eaten countless silent meals together while she assumed I was freeloading and I was actually coordinating national security operations. She looked around her house, as if seeing it for the first time, understanding that the space she thought of as her private refuge had actually been serving as a base of operations for activities that extended far beyond anything she had imagined possible. The transformation in her expression was remarkable to watch, shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe as she began to comprehend the magnitude of what had been happening under her roof, while she saw only her brother's apparent failure to launch a successful adult life. The man she had been supporting out of family obligation was actually the man who had been protecting her and thousands of others from threats that required his sacrifice of normal family relationships and personal recognition. Captain Rodriguez informed us that the federal agents would arrive within the hour to brief Sarah on the classified aspects of the situation and to coordinate the transition of my operational status given that my cover was now completely compromised. He said that Sarah would need to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding what she had learned, but that she would also receive briefings that would help her understand the scope and importance of the work I had been doing while appearing to be unemployed. Sarah looked at me with new eyes, seeing not the brother who had disappointed her for months, but the officer who had been serving with distinction while allowing her to believe he was a failure. The guilt was written across her face as she realized how her impatience and frustration had been directed at someone who was actually making sacrifices she could never have imagined, who was serving in ways that required him to accept her disappointment and criticism as part of his duty. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to understand everything, and I want to help however I can. I have been so wrong about everything, so unfair to you, so completely blind to what was actually happening. How do I make up for months of treating a general like a deadbeat, for calling the police on someone who has been protecting people like me?" I told her that no apology was necessary, that her reaction had been exactly what my cover required, that her genuine frustration and disappointment had actually helped maintain the believability of my civilian identity. I explained that the best families of deep cover operatives were those who reacted naturally to the cover story, who provided authentic emotional responses that made the deception convincing to anyone who might be watching or investigating. The federal agents arrived as Captain Rodriguez had predicted, serious men and women in dark suits who moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to managing classified situations that intersected with civilian lives. They briefed Sarah on the basic outlines of the operation I had been involved in, explained the legal obligations that now applied to her knowledge of classified information, and helped her understand that her house had been serving as more than just family accommodation. Sarah learned that the terrorist cell we had been tracking had been planning attacks on the shopping center where she often went for lunch, the courthouse where she worked every day, the community college where our neighbor's daughter was taking evening classes. She discovered that my presence in her house had been part of a surveillance and coordination operation that had prevented those attacks from occurring, that had protected her and thousands of others from violence that would have shattered the peaceful community life she took for granted. The magnitude of what had been prevented, combined with the realization that her brother had been central to that prevention while she criticized him for lack of ambition, was overwhelming for her to process. She sat quietly while the agents explained how deep cover operations worked, how officers like me accepted personal cost and family misunderstanding as necessary elements of service that could not be accomplished through conventional military channels. When the federal agents finished their briefing and left, Sarah and I found ourselves alone in her kitchen for the first time since the police had arrived hours earlier. The atmosphere between us had changed completely, charged with new understanding and the awkwardness that comes when fundamental assumptions about reality prove to be wrong. She asked me what happened next, whether I would be reassigned now that my cover was blown, whether our family relationships could return to something approaching normal after months of deception that had been necessary but painful for everyone involved. I explained that my current mission was essentially complete, that the terrorist cell had been neutralized during the hours we had been dealing with the family crisis, and that my next assignment would likely allow for more normal family interactions. Sarah wanted to know about the years before this assignment, about all the times she had worried about my direction and prospects while I was actually serving with distinction in roles she could never have imagined. I told her what I could without compromising ongoing classified information, helping her understand that her brother had never been the failure she had perceived, but had been serving in ways that required the sacrifice of family understanding and personal recognition. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Sarah asking careful questions and me providing answers that balanced honesty with security requirements. She began to understand that military service at the highest levels sometimes required sacrifices that went far beyond physical danger or extended deployments, that some forms of service demanded the complete transformation of personal identity and the acceptance of family disappointment as necessary costs of protecting national security. As the shock wore off and understanding grew, Sarah's attitude shifted from guilt and confusion to something approaching pride in having unknowingly supported an operation that had protected her community. She realized that her house had been chosen not just for convenience, but because her character and reputation made her an ideal, unwitting partner in maintaining cover that protected both operational security and her own safety. She asked about our parents, about Marcus, about how the family would handle learning that their disappointment in me had been based on carefully constructed fiction, designed to serve purposes they could never have suspected. I explained that some information would always remain classified, but that they would be briefed on enough details to understand that their son and brother had been serving with honor even while appearing to be struggling with direction and purpose. The relationship between Sarah and me changed fundamentally that night, not just because she learned the truth about my service, but because she understood the depth of sacrifice that my assignments had required. She realized that allowing her to be disappointed in me, accepting her criticism and frustration, had been part of my duty, one of the costs of serving in ways that demanded complete commitment to maintaining cover even with the people closest to me. Captain Rodriguez returned the next morning to check on how we were processing the previous day's revelations and to coordinate with federal officials about the ongoing security implications of my exposed cover. He brought Sarah a letter of commendation explaining, in terms that did not compromise classified information, that her cooperation and support had contributed to the success of operations that had direct impact on community safety and national security objectives. Sarah read the letter twice, her hands shaking slightly as she absorbed official recognition that her months of reluctant housing assistance had actually been months of unknowing participation in preventing terrorist attacks on targets that included her own workplace and community gathering places. The letter thanked her for her unwitting but essential contribution to operations that could not have succeeded without the natural civilian cover that her family situation had provided. The family dinner that Sunday was unlike any we had ever experienced. Sarah had coordinated with federal officials about what could be shared with our parents and Marcus, and they arrived knowing only that there had been some kind of misunderstanding about my employment status and that certain information about my actual work was now being declassified for family awareness. Mom cried when Captain Rodriguez, who had been invited to help explain the situation, described my years of distinguished service and my current role in protecting American communities from threats that required deep cover operations to address effectively. Dad sat quietly, processing the information that his son had been serving with honor and distinction during all the years when he had worried about my lack of direction and conventional success. Marcus struggled the most with the revelation, his worldview of personal responsibility and individual achievement challenged by learning that his lectures about accountability had been directed at someone who was actually serving in ways that required the sacrifice of personal recognition and family approval. He apologized repeatedly, his entrepreneur's understanding of success and failure proving inadequate for comprehending service that demanded the appearance of failure as essential operational cover. The neighborhood gradually learned that something significant had happened at Sarah's house, though the details remained appropriately vague. The story that emerged was that there had been a misunderstanding about a family member's actual employment and status, and that federal officials had been involved in clarifying certain security-related matters. People understood that someone they had perceived as unemployed was actually involved in important work that could not be publicly discussed. Captain Rodriguez became a regular visitor, not in his official capacity, but as someone whose respect for my service had created a friendship that extended beyond military relationships. He helped the family understand that deep cover operations were among the most challenging assignments in military service, requiring psychological strength and personal sacrifice that went far beyond conventional combat roles. Sarah's attitude toward me transformed completely, though she struggled with guilt about her months of impatience and criticism. I assured her that her natural reactions had been essential to maintaining my cover, that her genuine frustration and disappointment had made my civilian identity convincing to anyone who might have been watching or investigating. Her authentic emotions had actually contributed to operational security in ways that she could never have planned or intended. The community's perception of me shifted gradually as word spread that the quiet man living with his sister was actually someone whose service had protected local families from threats they had never known existed. The change was subtle but real, reflected in the way neighbors nodded when they saw me, the way store clerks treated me with newfound respect, the way community members began to understand that appearances could be deceiving in ways they had never considered. Our family relationships evolved to accommodate the new understanding of who I actually was and what my service had required. Sarah became protective of my privacy, understanding that even with my cover blown for this assignment, future missions might require similar sacrifices and deceptions. She learned to see strength where she had previously seen weakness, service where she had seen selfishness, dedication where she had seen lack of direction. The house that had been a source of tension and misunderstanding became a place of genuine refuge, a space where I could be both the brother Sarah loved and the officer whose service protected people like her. She understood now that her home had been chosen as more than just temporary accommodation, that it had served purposes larger than family convenience, that her unwitting support had contributed to operations that made her community safer. Months later, when I received my next assignment, Sarah was part of the planning process, understanding how her cooperation could contribute to operational success while protecting both family relationships and national security objectives. She had learned that some forms of service required family members to be unknowing partners, that love sometimes meant accepting disappointment as necessary cover for work that could not be explained or acknowledged. The story of that day became family legend, though the details remained appropriately classified. Sarah would sometimes tell people about the morning she learned that her unemployed brother was actually a decorated general, though she never revealed the specific circumstances or the classified nature of the work that had brought me to her house. The story became one of hidden worth revealed, of the danger of judging appearances, of the complexity of service that sometimes required sacrifice of the very things that make service worthwhile. I learned that vindication, when it finally comes, carries its own burdens and responsibilities. Being seen for who you actually are after months or years of being misunderstood requires grace and patience with people whose misconceptions were necessary for larger purposes. The satisfaction of finally being known and respected by family must be balanced with understanding that their previous disappointment was not their fault, but part of the cost of serving in ways that demand deception even with those closest to you. The quiet dignity that had sustained me through months of family criticism became the foundation for relationships based on truth rather than necessary fiction. Sarah and I developed a bond stronger than simple sibling affection, based on shared understanding of service and sacrifice that most families never have to contemplate. We learned that love could survive revelation, that relationships could grow stronger when built on truth rather than comfortable assumptions. Years have passed since that day when Sarah called the police on her general brother, and our family has never forgotten the lesson about appearances and reality, about service and sacrifice, about the complexity of protecting people who may never know they need protection. We learned that some heroes wear uniforms that everyone can see, while others serve in ways that require them to appear as anything but heroic, accepting misunderstanding as part of their duty to something larger than personal recognition or family approval. Take a moment to think about the people in your life who might be serving in ways you cannot see, who might be carrying burdens they cannot share, who might be protecting you in ways that require them to appear as less than they actually are. Sometimes the greatest service happens in silence, and sometimes the people we think we know best are actually strangers whose real worth can only be revealed when circumstances finally allow the truth to surface.